Well, little buddy, it's going to be a big one today. The Mueller testimony will be right here on KIDO Talk Radio. Glenn Beck will have it. Sean Hannity will definitely have it. And we will take your phone calls throughout the morning on it. You'll hear from Mueller and the Muellerettes, witch hunt or, well, really witch hunt. We'll talk more about that coming up. And in another move, Congress looks to legalize marijuana. That's right, marijuana. So that would eliminate the argument of Kevin Miller, who says it's the supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution. And as long as there's a federal law against marijuana, there will be no legalization of it. But that could change. Why? Well, we'll tell you about that between now and 9 o'clock. Joining us now, Casey Pipes, author of After the Fall, the remarkable comeback of Richard Milhous Nixon. Casey, good morning.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
First, what do you make of the comparisons of what happened with Richard Nixon to what's going to happen today with Donald Trump?
I mean, there are comparisons between the two presidents. Many people have noted that the two men were friends. I note in the book that Nixon kind of had his eye on Trump as a real rising star, even for politics. He wrote him a letter in the late 80s and said that he had seen him on TV. Actually, his wife, Pat, had seen Trump on TV and thought he did a great job and thought that he might end up running for something and that he would be, quote, a winner when he did. That letter is now framed and hanging in the Oval Office. It's one of Trump's prized possessions. There are comparisons, I think particularly beyond just the Mueller report and the things going on with his testimony today. There's a lot of comparisons on policy, particularly foreign policy, where Trump in some ways is a throwback to Nixon-style realism. So I do think that there's a lot of common ground between the two. And, today is today and Mueller is Mueller. And it's hard to draw exact comparisons to that. But it's an interesting topic, and the two men did know each other and did share some common ground.
All right, Casey, I'm going to get personal. You seem like a young man. How old are you?
46.
All right. Well, okay. You sound a lot younger, sir. I was going to say, how in the world could Richard Nixon captivate you so much that you would write a book about this? But you kind of were around when, see, I'm 51, so I remember Watergate as a little kid, as much as a little kid could, but that he made that much of an impression on you that you would devote this considerable amount of time to write about the most vilified president, and Jeff Davis wasn't a president other than Jeff Davis in American history.
I think Nixon is one of the great stories in American presidential history, and the story of his post-presidency is one of the great untold stories in Nixon history. I mean, this is a piece of his story that we really don't know much about until now. I mean, there's been bits and pieces of it told. There was a Robert Sam Anson book that came out in the 80s that covered the first few years of his exile. Of course, Monica Crowley wrote a couple of memoirs about her time at the tail end of his life working for him. But no one's told the story of the whole 20 years. And what I found in the research was he was way more active and he was way more successful in this period than we've ever realized. I mean, he is advising President Reagan on strategy with Gorbachev. He's advising President Bush after Tiananmen Square. He's advising President Clinton with Yeltsin in Russia. So he becomes an advisor and counselor, an elder statesman that three presidents from two different parties routinely call on for advice and counsel. And if you think about where he was in August of 74 and how toxic he was, it's a remarkable turn of events, a remarkable comeback, and that's the story of this book.
Indeed. And Casey, you outside of Pat Buchanan, who was close to Nixon and defended Nixon, really have highlighted Nixon's contributions. I turned to a Bob Woodward book that depicts all the scandals, and whether we like Bob Woodward or not. There was a story about the tailhook admiral that got relieved of his command, and whether he was responsible for it or not, he was held accountable. And President Bush fired him, and he gets a phone call, and it's the president of the United States, and he's thinking it's President Bush at the time, who was the commander in chief. It was President Nixon that just gave him words of encouragement. And that book, I read that book 20 years ago, and I thought to myself, my gosh, President Nixon at the time, and a lot of people don't know this, he was coming out with books all the time and really rehabilitating himself. But in your book, when you're talking about After the Fall, that's just one example of how Nixon really was this shadow consigliere, or whatever you want to say, this advisor to so many people. And here you have this admiral that's disgraced, feeling down, and there's Richard Nixon consoling him and cheering him up.
It's amazing how many of these little stories are out there. There's a story in my book about Bud McFarlane, who was Reagan's national security advisor, who during the Iran-Contra crisis attempted suicide. He survived it, and when he woke up in the hospital, who's the first person sitting there across from him in the hospital room but Richard Nixon? He came to check on his old friend, and he was constantly reaching out to people. He had a tremendous amount of empathy, I feel like, in this period because of his troubles in Watergate for people who had fallen on hard times. He reached out to them. He wanted to console them. And that's very much a part of this book. And then the other part of the book is the policy advice he's giving out, which is remarkable. I mean, he's helping Reagan. When Reagan comes up with the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative to block a nuclear attack, Nixon is the one who goes to him and says, you should use this as leverage with Gorbachev. And if he refuses to negotiate with you until you give up SDI, don't give up SDI, offer to share it with him. With exactly what Reagan does. It brings Gorbachev to the negotiating table. And, of course, we have the 1987 INF Treaty. So he was way more active during this time and way more successful than we've ever realized. And it was fascinating for me to research it, and I hope it's fascinating for people to read about.
Well, what motivated Richard Nixon post-presidency? Was it writing books? Was it time with his family? And how did you win the trust of the Nixon family, considering the history and everything else that they've been through?
So the papers that I researched are the post-presidential papers. They are privately held. They're not a part of his presidential record. They are controlled by the two daughters. So I had to get Tricia Cox and Julie Eisenhower to bless this project, which they both did. I think during this time, what I found, he wrote in a diary entry in late 1974 that his road back would involve, and these were his words, writing books, making speeches, and appearing on television when possible to put things into perspective. So he's very much trying to provide some context for his life and his career, both the triumphs of it and the tragedies. And then he's so successful at this. I mean, his books become bestsellers, his speeches, I mean, he's sought all over the country for speeches. He's fascinating to listen to. He's so good at this that eventually he achieves a level of acceptance. People show him grace. The public kind of takes him back in. And by the time the 1980s roll around, he's acceptable enough that Ronald Reagan can routinely talk to him about foreign policy. Same thing with President Bush later. Same thing with President Clinton. All three of those men, he actually returned physically to the White House and met with them in person to discuss foreign policy, which would have been unthinkable in August of 1974 when no one wanted to touch him. So it's a tribute to how hard he worked and how well he used his greatest gift, which was his mind, his intellect, to show that he had ideas on foreign policy that people should listen to. And they did. They sought him out and they wanted his advice, and he became very much a beloved elder statesman in many ways.
Casey Pipes joining us, author of the new book, After the Fall, Life After Watergate for Richard Nixon. Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. Not that you're a psychologist, maybe you are a sociologist, but what really motivated Richard Nixon, considering he was public enemy number one and was so beloved at the end? And Casey, please correct me. I believe his wife died before him.
She did. She died a year before.
And watching him at her funeral, just bawling and crying, was such a different image than we saw perpetrated by the media. Can you give us an insight into the man? Instead of just hanging out, collecting his pension, Nixon contributed, as you said, more after his presidency than during his historic presidency.
Yeah, I mean, this period of his life is probably the most humanizing period of his life. I mean, we see him without the trappings of power. We see him not on center stage anymore. And it's very he's a real person, and he's trying to find his way in this world. He's trying to rehabilitate himself in some ways. There's a number of really gut-wrenching stories in the book with family and friends where he's emotional and he's talking about life and his life and some of the things he's gone through. There's a moment in 1990 shortly after they've dedicated the Nixon Library, and he gathers with a bunch of friends and family, and he tells a story about when he had his first grandchild, and the grandchild was asking, "What should we call you? Should we call you Grandpa or Papa or Granddad?" And Nixon says, "You can call me anything because I've been called everything." Wow. And the number of people in the crowd that heard him say this, there was a small group of friends. George McGovern, ironically, was there. They were Democrats as well. They were crying. I mean, it was emotional to see what he had gone through and how he had suffered and what the price he had paid. And there's a lot of that in this book, a lot of stories that sort of humanize him and show him in a different light. But I think his motivation was the same as anybody else. He wanted to be useful. He wanted to use his mind as best he could. He worried. He talked to his staff about not working. He worried that if he stopped working, if he stopped writing books, if he stopped speaking, that he would sort of begin to decline mentally. So he wanted to stay very sharp mentally, and the way he did that was using his mind and writing books and giving speeches and giving advice to presidents. And he, as I've documented in this book, did it pretty well.
After the fall, the remarkable comeback of Richard Nixon. Casey Pipes joining us. Kevin Miller in the morning. KIDO Talk Radio on sale yesterday, available on Amazon now. Let's go back to a lot of us, Casey. We've all been through triumphs and tragedies, whether it's on the air or not. I always say what I could have been, that old Supertramp song, The Long Way Home. What about for Richard Nixon? Did he ever look back and what a run that he had and things that he instituted then, still a vibrant frameworks of our government institutions today? Did he ever wonder what could have been?
He was asked several times during this period what history would say about him, and he would always sort of joke and say, well, it depends on who's writing the history. Historians tend to be liberal, and but hopefully, in addition, and he always said, they'll mention Watergate, that's a part of the record, but hopefully they'll mention all of the other achievements as well. So he understood the price he was going to have to pay historically. He knew it was not going to go away. But he hoped that people would look at the whole record. And of course, there's a wonderful moment at the very end of the book. It's at his funeral when President Clinton delivers the eulogy and says that the day of judging Richard Nixon on only Watergate must come to an end. It's a remarkable speech, by a man who grew up in Arkansas politics as a Democrat during the Watergate era, running against the Watergate era and the Republicans. His wife Hillary, of course, we know, worked in the Senate investigating Nixon as part of the Watergate team. So it's just amazing that 20 years later, here's this Democratic president giving this magisterial eulogy in which he praises Nixon and says, if you're only looking at Watergate, you're missing the real story here. This was a man of real consequence, and people should pay attention to the whole record. And I think that moment, that funeral, that speech helped people see that he really does deserve to be remembered for more than just Watergate.
It's sad that the media doesn't understand his impact and the stories you've shared with us this morning, or even the idea of calling somebody when he was down. And again, Richard Nixon was famous for that. Who do you think he was closest to in his later years, president or public figure? Anybody?
It's a great question. He had a number of friends in Washington that he stayed in pretty regular contact with. One of whom was Bob Dole. He was very close with Dole. They talked fairly regularly. He wanted Dole to run in 96. In fact, he orchestrates, in many ways, he sort of plans out his funeral so that Dole and Pete Wilson will be the two Republican speakers in addition to President Clinton. And he does that because he wants to give them a platform. He wants them to be able to speak to the nation. And this is a nationally televised event. He wants to kind of prop them up. Dole is somebody that he talked to quite a bit. There were a number of people in the Reagan administration that he was close with. Of course, he was close to Al Haig, who was Reagan's first Secretary of State. Mike Deaver, who worked for Reagan and was very, very close to Nixon as well. There were a number of people like that, but he was an introvert. I mean, this is a guy who was an intellectual. He was not really good at the retail politics side of things. He liked to sit in his office and write and think and read and reflect. And so he was not really the most sociable guy. I mean, we all know that, but he had important relationships that he stayed in touch with, but he was, in some ways, a loner. I mean, he always kind of was miscast in politics in that sense.
And one remembers Bob Dole crying at Nixon's funeral.
Yeah, Dole gave a great speech, too. I mean, Clinton is the one we remember from that day, but Dole had a wonderful tribute, had a recurring refrain of how American. He would describe Nixon's life, and he would say, how American, over and over again. It was a really great moment for Dole, and undoubtedly did what Nixon hoped it would do, which was sort of propel Dole forward to the 1996 nomination.
Yeah. Casey, thank you for writing this book. I'm going to order it on Amazon right now. I urge everyone to do this. It's a fascinating part of American history, and really, not to go Dr. Phil on Oprah on you, but it's a great lesson in perseverance.
I think it is, and I enjoyed learning about this period. There's a lot of things in here we didn't know before, and I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that we're not defined by our biggest loss. All of us. It's true for all of us. There can always be a comeback, and you can always make a difference. And I think he certainly tried to do that in his last 20 years. Well,
Casey, we'd love to have you back, and thank you for taking time with us.
My pleasure.
Back to the timeliness of this. Any big predictions today?
You know, one thing I've learned in the Trump era is that there are no predictions. I mean, all bets are off. So, I mean, who knows? I mean, I can't imagine Mueller will say anything we don't already know. But we'll see. It'll be great theater for sure.
Casey, good luck with the book. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, there you have it. Casey Pipes joining us. After the Fall, the new book on Richard Nixon. And part of the problem, one of the many problems with the media today is and I talk about this with Daniel Tiger, I talk about this with Ray Amaya, we talk about it. Instead of getting something that is long form and well read and it takes time in this ADD world, it's like a number 5. It's like a number 5 at McDonald's today. That's how we digest information. And I'm the same way. I hope you're not. But Richard Milhous Nixon, just after Watergate, and you'll never hear it on the lib networks, just contributed so much to American history. By the way, today is Robert Mueller Day. We're declaring that officially here on KIDO Talk Radio. When Mueller and the crazy, wacky libs go at it, you'll hear it here. And once you hear it, if you have something to say, we want to hear what you have to say as well. Right now, they're all gathering like, well, you can use the description on Capitol Hill. Coming up next, Congress wants to give marijuana folks money. We're on the path to legalization, unfortunately, and Weedology opens in Ontario. Should we all toke up with our eggs over easy? Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio. And we are on the Mueller Watch. Ding, ding, ding goes the Mueller bell. Kevin Miller in the morning. Blessed to be with you. Ray Amaya taking your calls at 580-5436. 580-KIDO. So forget the triple digits. Forget everything else. It's all about Robert Mueller. The witch hunt continues. The president tweeting, keep America great again, make America great again. And he's right about that. But the Mueller testimony, let's get a preview from our own Griff Jenkins on KIDO Talk Radio.
A 5-minute opening statement from the chairman, Democrat Jerry Nadler. That'll be followed by a 5-minute opening statement.
Jerry Nadler, boo.
By Ranking Member Doug Collins. Then they'll swear Special Counsel Mueller in. He'll deliver his opening statement, and the questions will begin. There's going to be a lot of questions. There's 41 members on this committee. Alongside Mueller will be his longtime attorney and aide, Aaron Zebley, who was added at the request of Mueller at the last minute. From the president's tweet, though, he did not approve.
He didn't approve of that. That is our own Griff Jenkins. KIDO Talk Radio, Kevin Miller in the morning, traffic and weather together. Let's get you to work safely and on time. Good morning, Dave. And I'm Kevin Miller in the morning. Coming up, Bob Mueller, you, me, and the move to legalize pot at the federal level. Why? You guessed it. It's all about the Benjamins. We'll talk about those stories and more. Kevin Miller, KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Good morning, Maggie. And rolling on the right side, Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Right now, Jerry Nadler is yapping to Robert Mueller saying, "You're the best ever. We love you, Robert Mueller." We'll wait to hear what Robert Mueller has to say, but we'll take your calls on the Mueller testimony, this crazy, wacky, zany witch hunt at 580-5436, 580-KIDO. Liberty Linda joins us now. Good morning, Liberty Linda.
Good morning, Kevin. You know, when I was a young girl, my aunt and uncle lived right on the beach in San Clemente, California, and we used to sit out on their deck and watch Richard Nixon play golf right in front of us. It was a golf course and ran all the way down to the ocean there. And I think my uncle actually knew him. And I was just a little girl, but I just remember that. So I really want to get Casey's book, because I always heard that Richard Nixon was a really nice person, so like what you were talking about this morning. So I just thought I'd, let people know that he was a great golfer. He was really good at it. He enjoyed it. And so anyway, I think it would be wonderful to get a book about Richard Nixon.
Well,
I think that all that was said about him was just to get him out of office way back then. I didn't know much about it, of course. I was just a little bitty girl. But thank you for having him on this morning.
Well, we thought it was a good idea, and that was Ray Amaya's call on that one. But, it's fascinating. You've got Jerry Nadler running back. We have a responsibility to address the evidence that the special prosecutor uncovered. Robert Mueller, you're the best. You think to yourself, this is nothing more than the sneaky little loony leftovers going after the president one more time. What is this going to accomplish? Your thoughts, Liberty Linda.
Well, it's so ridiculous. I think I would call it a circus. This is it. The whole thing is ridiculous. We're all going to watch, of course, because what in the world's going to happen today? What's going to be said? Is his attorney going to be able to talk as well? So far, all I've heard is attorneys, they can whisper into their ear.
Well, who's the dummy and who's the ventriloquist?
I agree. This is going to be so interesting to watch, of course.
Well, and to listen, we've got...
Listen, of course.
Now we've got Doug Collins delivering his opening statement, which is will be as exciting as paint drying. But really, it comes down to this. Do you believe the president? And let's face it, with all, as Sean Hannity says, with all these hired never-Trumpers, they couldn't come up with anything. And so now we have to have this hearing today, the gotcha hearing.
Right.
That's what they should call it, the gotcha day.
It's so ridiculous what's going on in our Congress and our fabulous four, which aren't fabulous, and how ridiculous this is to watch is actually going on in our country. It's unbelievable, and so thankful that we have the president that we have today that I think makes common sense. So that's what I have to say about it, and we're just going to sit back and listen. And we love calling into the Kevin Miller Show and giving our opinions.
Well, we love your opinions. Thank you, Liberty Linda.
Glad for you to be there for us, Kevin. Thank you so much. We love you.
We love you. Take care now.
Okay, you as well. Bye-bye.
We're fighting the urge here to have Doug Collins' opening statement. You'll have Mueller's statement in a minute, and you'll hear these things throughout the morning, but here's Mitch McConnell.
We've already heard from him. It seems to me, I don't know how many times we want to see this movie again, but I think the American people have moved on past this.
I don't think it's going to change public opinion. Having been involved in the Clinton impeachment, if the public's not with you, you'll pay a price.
There we have it. That is Lindsey Graham. Kevin Miller in the morning here. KIDO Talk Radio, 580-5436, 580-KIDO. Before we get to some other news of the day, and again, we'll get to Mueller in a minute.
Not that AOC is a bargain, because she's not. I mean, she's no bargain. Look, I mean, we'll go into it at some point. I'll tell you all about AOC. I got more on AOC.
There's the President of the United States. So again, you'll hear from Robert Mueller coming up. But first, the U.S. cannabis industry moved one step closer to gaining access to banking services as the Senate held its first committee hearing on a bipartisan bill to protect banks from cannabis-related penalties. So really what the cannabis industry has done is they've gone to where the politicians are, to where the politicians are moved. Some people are moved by, food. Some people are motivated by relations. Other people are motivated by money. While the measure has received some pushback, it has also received support on both sides of the aisle, because they both want the money. They both want the money from the banks. Currently, banks cannot touch the weed industry. From Yahoo News, largely based on the hypothesis that access to financial services would reduce public safety risks for cannabis companies. In other words, the banks want the money. And the banks can't get the money, so they hire their lobbyist. They go to Capitol Hill and say, Senators, Congressmen, you work for us. Now get us a hold of the pot money. And the poor cannabis companies, they're upset because they have to deal in all cash because banks won't serve them because it's against federal law. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, a Democrat, one of the sponsors, said there's nothing good about forcing the cannabis industry to operate in cash. Let's fix this. Near the end of the hearing, the Senate Banking Committee's chairman, Mike Crapo, acknowledged that testifying witnesses made strong cases to resolve banking issues related to cannabis, including problems that legacy cash poses for combating illegal cannabis transactions. In other words, once they let the banks have it, we're going to be on a paved road to federally legalizing marijuana, which is going to be tough for people in any type of industry. Once again, you people that love the pot, you people that love the marijuana, you people that vehemently disagree with me, and that's okay. I love disagreement. We should have more disagreement. Would you want your surgeon? Would you want your pilot? Would you want anyone to be under the influence of pot while they're operating on you? Right? So again, Robert Mueller right now getting sworn in to the Mueller hearings. 580-5436, 580-KIDO. Also, bills that would legalize and tax marijuana at the national level and provide opportunities for people convicted of federal crimes to clear their records were introduced in Congress. Well, speaking of Congress, let's go to Mueller's testimony.
The committee. As you know, in May 2017, the acting attorney general asked me to serve as special counsel. I undertook that role because I believed that it was of paramount interest to the nation to determine whether a foreign adversary had interfered in the presidential election. As the acting attorney general said at the time, the appointment was necessary in order for the American people to have full confidence in the outcome. My staff and I carried out this assignment with that critical objective in mind: to work quietly, thoroughly, and with integrity so that the public would have full confidence in the outcome. The order appointing me as special counsel directed our office to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. This included investigating any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. It also included investigating efforts to interfere with or obstruct our investigation. Throughout the investigation, I continually stressed two things to the team that we had assembled. First, we needed to do our work as thoroughly as possible and as expeditiously as possible. It was in the public interest for our investigation to be complete but not to last a day longer than was necessary. Second, the investigation needed to be conducted fairly and with absolute integrity. Our team would not leak or take other actions that could compromise the integrity of our work. All decisions were made based on the facts and the law. During the course of our investigation, we charged more than 30 defendants with committing federal crimes, including 12 officers of the Russian military.
And we'll have more from Robert Mueller next. Kevin Miller on your home for Hannity, KIDO Talk Radio. All right, when you hear Robert Mueller on the air, on the radio, KIDO Talk Radio is carrying Mueller. Here he is.
Of every American. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Director Mueller, the President has repeatedly claimed that your report found there was no obstruction and that it completely and totally exonerated him. But that is not what your report said, is it?
Correct. It is not what the report said.
And now, reading from page 2 of volume 2 of your report that's on the screen, you wrote, quote, "If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the President clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment," close quote. Now, does that say there was no obstruction?
No.
In fact, you were actually unable to conclude the President did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
Well, we, at the outset, determined that we, when it came to the President's culpability, we needed to go forward only after taking into account the OLC opinion that indicated that a president, a sitting president, cannot be indicted.
So the report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the President?
No.
Now, in fact, your report expressly states that it does not exonerate the President.
It does.
And your investigation actually found, quote, multiple acts by the President that were capable of exerting undue influence over law enforcement investigations, including the Russian interference and obstruction investigations. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, Director Mueller, can you explain in plain terms what that finding means so the American people can understand it?
Well, the finding indicates that the President was not that the President was not exculpated for the acts that he allegedly committed.
In fact, you were talking about incidents, quote, in which the President sought to use his official power outside of usual channels, unquote, to exert undue influence over your investigations. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, am I correct that on page 7 of volume 2 of your report, you wrote, quote, the President became aware that his own conduct was being investigated in an obstruction of justice inquiry. At that point, the President engaged in a second phase of conduct involving public attacks on the investigation, non-public efforts to control it, and efforts in both public and private to encourage witnesses not to cooperate with the investigation, close quote. So President Trump's efforts to exert undue influence over your investigation intensified after the President became aware that he personally was being investigated?
I stick with the language that you have in front of you. Which
okay.
comes from page 7, volume 2.
Now, is it correct that if you concluded that the President committed the crime of obstruction, you could not publicly state that in your report or here today?
Can you repeat the question, sir?
Is it correct that if you had concluded that the President committed the crime of obstruction, you could not publicly state that in your report or here today?
Well, I would say the statement would be that you would not indict, and you would not indict because under the OLC opinion, a sitting president, excuse me, cannot be indicted, be unconstitutional.
So you could not state that because of the OLC opinion, if that would have been your conclusion?
OLC opinion with some guide, yes.
But under DOJ, under Department of Justice policy, the president could be prosecuted for obstruction of justice crimes after he leaves office, is correct?
True.
Thank you. Did any senior White House official refuse a request to be interviewed by you and your team?
I don't believe so.
The president?
Well, let me take that back. I would have to look at it, but I'm not certain that that was the case.
Did the president refuse a request to be interviewed by you and your team?
Yes.
Yes. And is it true that you tried for more than a year to secure an interview with the president?
Yes.
And is it true that you and your team advised the president's lawyer that, quote, an interview with the president is vital to our investigation, close quote?
Yes.
And is it true that you also, quote, stated that it is in the interest of the presidency and the public for an interview to take place, close quote?
Yes.
But the president still refused to sit for an interview by you or your team?
True. True.
And did you also ask him to provide written answers to questions on the 10 possible episodes of obstruction of justice crimes involving him?
Yes.
Did he provide any answers to a single question about whether he engaged in obstruction of justice crimes?
I would have to check on that. I'm not certain.
Director Mueller, we are grateful that you are here to explain your investigation and findings. Having reviewed your work, I believe anyone else who would engage in the conduct described in your report would have been criminally prosecuted. Your work is vitally important to this committee and the American people because no one is above the law.
There you have it. Chairman Nadler coming up. The Republicans will respond first. You're listening to KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Good morning, Dave. No Fox News. We will continue with the Mueller hearings. Now, Representative Doug Collins interviewing Robert Mueller on KIDO Talk Radio.
The investigative team included 19 lawyers and approximately 40 FBI agents and analysts and accountants. Are those numbers accurate?
Could you repeat that, please?
40 FBI agents, 19 lawyers, intelligence analysts, and forensic accountants. Are those numbers accurate? This was included in your report.
Generally, yes.
Is it also true that you issued over 2,800 subpoenas, executed nearly 500 search warrants, obtained more than 230 orders for communication records, and 50 pen registers?
That went a little fast for me.
Okay. In your report, I'll make this very simple. You did a lot of work, correct?
Yes, that I agree.
A lot of subpoenas, a lot of pen registers?
A lot of subpoenas. Yes.
Okay, we'll walk this really slow if we need to.
A lot of search warrants.
All right, a lot of search warrants, a lot of things. So you're very thorough.
What?
In your opinion, very thorough. You listed this out in your report, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Is it true, the evidence gathered during your investigation, given the questions that you have just answered, is it true the evidence gathered during your investigation did not establish that the president was involved in the underlying crime related to Russian election interference as stated in Volume 1, page 7?
We found insufficient evidence of the president's culpability.
So that would be a yes.
Pardon?
That would be a yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Isn't it true the evidence did not establish that the president or those close to him were involved in the charged Russian computer hacking or active measure conspiracies, or that the president otherwise had unlawful relationships with any Russian official? Volume 2, page 76, correct?
I leave the answer to our report.
So as a yes. Is that any true your investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with Russian government in the election interference activity? Volume 1, page 2, Volume 1, page 173.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Although your report states collusion is not so specific offense, and you said that this morning, or a term of art in federal criminal law, conspiracy is. In the colloquial context, are collusion and conspiracy essentially synonymous terms?
You're going to have to repeat that for me.
Collusion is not a specific offense or a term of art in the federal criminal law. Conspiracy is.
Yes.
In the colloquial context, known public context, collusion and conspiracy are essentially synonymous terms, correct?
No.
If no, on page 180 of volume 1 of your report, you wrote, as defined in legal dictionaries, collusion is largely synonymous with conspiracy, as that crime is set forth in the General Federal Conspiracy Statute 18 U.S.C. 371. You said at your May 29th press conference and here today, you choose your words carefully. Are you sitting here today testifying something different than what your report states?
Well, what I'm asking is if you can give me the citation, I can look at the citation and evaluate whether it is.
Okay, let me just be clarified. You stated that you would stay within the report. I just stated your report back to you. And you said that collusion and conspiracy were not synonymous terms. That was your answer, was no.
That's correct.
In that, page 180 of volume 1 of your report, it says, as defined in legal dictionaries, collusion is largely synonymous with conspiracy as that crime is set forth in General Conspiracy Statute 18 U.S.C. 371. Now, you said you chose your words carefully. Are you contradicting your report right now?
Not when I read it.
So you would change your answer to yes then?
No. If you look at the language.
I'm reading your report, sir. It's a yes or no answer.
Page 180.
Page 180, volume 1.
Okay.
This was from your report.
Correct. And I'll leave it with the report.
So the report says, yes, they are synonymous.
Yes.
Hopefully, for finally, out of your own report, we can put to bed the collusion and conspiracy. One last question as we're going through. Did you ever look into other countries investigated in the Russian interference into our election? Were other countries investigated or found knowledge that they had an interference in our election?
I'm not going to discuss other matters.
That I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California.
Director Mueller, as you've heard from the chairman, we're mostly going to talk about obstruction of justice today, but the investigation of Russia's attack that started your investigation is why evidence of possible obstruction is serious. To what extent did the Russian government interfere in the 2016 presidential election?
Could you repeat that, ma'am?
To what extent did the Russian government interfere in the 2016 presidential election?
Well, particularly when it came to computer crimes and the like, the government was implicated.
So you wrote in Volume 1 that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. You also described in your report that the then Trump campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, shared with a Russian operative, Kilimnik, the campaign strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states in internal polling data of the campaign. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
They also discussed the status of the Trump campaign and Manafort's strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states. Months before that meeting, Manafort had caused internal data to be shared with Kilimnik, and the sharing continued for some period of time after their August meeting. Isn't that correct?
Accurate.
In fact, your investigation found that Manafort briefed Kilimnik on the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election, and that briefing encompassed the campaign's messaging, its internal polling data. It also included discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identified as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Did your investigation determine who requested the polling data to be shared with Kilimnik?
Well, I would direct you to the report and adopt what we have in the report with regard to that particular issue.
We don't have the redacted version. That's maybe another reason why we should get that for Volume 1. Based on your investigation, how could the Russian government have used this campaign polling data to further its sweeping and systematic interference in the 2016 presidential election?
That's a little bit out of our path.
Fair enough. Did your investigation find that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from one of the candidates winning?
Yes.
And which candidate would that be?
Well, it would be Trump.
Correct. Now, the Trump campaign wasn't exactly reluctant to take Russian help. You wrote it expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, was the investigation's determination, what was the investigation's determination regarding the frequency with which the Trump campaign made contact with the Russian government?
Well, I would have to refer you to the report on that.
Well, we went through and we counted 126 contacts between Russians or their agents and Trump campaign officials or their associates. So would that sound about right?
I can't say. I understand the statistic, and I believe it. I understand the statistic.
Well, Mr. Mueller, I appreciate your being here and your report. From your testimony and the report, I think the American people have learned several things. First, the Russians wanted Trump to win. Second, the Russians went on a sweeping cyber influence campaign. The Russians hacked the DNC, and they got the Democratic game plan for the election. The Russian campaign chairman met with Russian agents and repeatedly gave them internal data, polling, and messaging in the battleground states. So while the Russians were buying ads and creating propaganda to influence the outcome of the election, they were armed with inside information that they had stolen through hacking from the DNC and that they had been given by the Trump campaign chairman, Mr. Manafort. My colleagues will probe the efforts undertaken to keep this information from becoming public, but I think it's important for the American people to understand the gravity of the underlying problem that your report uncovered. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
And there we have it. You're listening to the Robert Mueller testimony on KIDO Talk Radio. That's 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Kevin Miller in the morning. They're going back and forth, and we'll take your calls on the testimony as we move along. Don't forget Glenn Beck. Sean Hannity will have much, much more, and we'll have complete coverage today and tomorrow. Again, here are the folks doing this. Now we have the Republican, Mr. Raitt.
Determination on whether there was an obstruction of justice crime committed by the president. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
All right. Now, in explaining that special counsel did not make what you called a traditional prosecution or declination decision, the report on the bottom of page 2 of volume 2 reads as follows. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Now, I read that correctly?
Yes.
All right. Now, your report, and today you said at all times the special counsel team operated under, was guided by, and followed Justice Department policies and principles. So, which DOJ policy or principle sets forth a legal standard that an investigated person is not exonerated if their innocence from criminal conduct is not conclusively determined?
Can you repeat the last part of that question?
Yeah. Which DOJ policy or principle set forth a legal standard that an investigated person is not exonerated if their innocence from criminal conduct is not conclusively determined? Where does that language come from, Director? Where is the DOJ policy that says that? Can you let me make it easier?
Sorry, go ahead.
Can you give me an example other than Donald Trump where the Justice Department determined that an investigated person was not exonerated because their innocence was not conclusively determined?
I cannot, but this is a unique situation.
Well, you can't. Time is short. I've got 5 minutes. Let's just leave it at you can't find it because I'll tell you why. It doesn't exist. The special counsel's job, nowhere does it say that you were to conclusively determine Donald Trump's innocence or that the special counsel report should determine whether or not to exonerate him. It's not in any of the documents. It's not in your appointment order. It's not in the special counsel regulations. It's not in the OLC opinions. It's not in the Justice Manual. And it's not in the principles of federal prosecution. Nowhere do those words appear together because respectfully, Director, it was not the special counsel's job to conclusively determine Donald Trump's innocence or to exonerate him because the bedrock principle of our justice system is a presumption of innocence. It exists for everyone. Everyone is entitled to it, including sitting presidents. And because there is a presumption of innocence, prosecutors never, ever need to conclusively determine it. Now, Director, the special counsel applied this inverted burden of proof that I can't find and you said doesn't exist anywhere in the department policies, and you used it to write a report. And the very first line of your report, says, and as you read this morning, it authorizes the special counsel to provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions reached by the special counsel. That's the very first word of your report, right?
That's correct.
Here's the problem, Director. The special counsel didn't do that. On volume 1, you did. On volume 2, with respect to potential obstruction of justice, the special counsel made neither a prosecution decision or a declination decision. You made no decision. You told us this morning and in your report that you made no determination. So respectfully, Director, you didn't follow the special counsel regulations. It clearly says, write a confidential report about decisions reached. Nowhere in here does it say, write a report about decisions that weren't reached. You wrote 180 pages. 180 pages about decisions that weren't reached, about potential crimes that weren't charged or decided. And respectfully, by doing that, you managed to violate every principle and the most sacred of traditions about prosecutors not offering extra prosecutorial analysis about potential crimes that aren't charged. So Americans need to know this as they listen to the Democrats and socialists on the other side of the aisle, as they do dramatic readings from this report, that volume 2 of this report was not authorized under the law to be written. It was written to a legal standard that does not exist at the Justice Department. And it was written in violation of every DOJ principle about extra prosecutorial commentary. I agree with the chairman this morning when he said Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where volume 2 of this report puts him.
All right, you're listening to KIDO Talk Radio. The Mueller hearings continue. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick commercial break while the libs are speaking, and then we'll come back and hear the truth. Traffic and weather together, KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Dave.